that's what's kind of brought me to my current concern in writing, which is based all around the hag. And it's about exploring what happens to women when menopause hits. What is this crazy invisibility that has kind of shrouded this whole reverse puberty that everyone goes through? And yes, there's a lot of discourse now about menopause, but think of for how many years this process, which 51% of the human population go through, wasn't given any kind of radio coverage because it was felt to be somehow distasteful or somehow something not to be mentioned. So last year I released a novella with PS Publishing, which is called The Shut Me Up, which is based on the life of aristocrat Moira Rua O'Brien and the way she became demonized for later generations because she was a difficult, stubborn woman who would not be tamed and who would not bow the knee and who resorted to Machiavellian kind of strategies to keep her lands together, not just for herself, but for her children. And at the moment, I'm working on a big project, which is a big collection of stories that are based around the hag as she reappears in our contemporary era.
What's really interesting is, just as a side note, you might find this interesting. I've had some health issues of my own when I was in Santa Fe and still, but I went to go see a somatic therapist there who was a curandera from Mexico, who was also a social worker. She'd gone through Western trained therapy. So she was 82, I think, 83. And just this really, really powerful, powerful woman. And she basically, said to me when we first were meeting, she said, "Oh, how old were you? How old are you?" And I said, "Oh, I'm 50." And she said, "Oh." And I said, What?" And she said, "Oh, when you're 52 as a woman, that's when you're given your bundle of gifts. So
Oh,
the
I'm
gods come."
52.
Yeah, so the gods come and they bring your bundle of gifts, whatever they may be, and you're supposed to use those birthrights, those gifts to go out and change the world and make it a better place. And so I just thought to myself, okay, that's pretty profound. Now, my bundle of gifts was, some people might say some of them were super negative, but I had to go through all of it to understand and be where I am today. However, I thought that knowledge was really powerful and that every woman should know that at 52, if you live long enough, the angels, the spirits, they give you your gifts so that you can go out and make this world a better place. The second thing I wanted to say was, at this point in my life, I friggin' love being invisible because it means I can be totally subversive and nobody's paying attention to me. I can sneak around, nobody's looking at me. I can do things, nobody's like, "Hey, who's that behind that curtain there?" Like, there's some feet sticking out from behind that curtain. Like, what's happening? Who is that? I can do things and get away with them, and nobody's paying attention. And for me, it's like a huge gift. And, of course, I want my podcast to be successful. I want my series of books to be successful. But I also find that I'm operating in this space that's really freeing and exciting. So that's just for me, though.
Can I share something with you? And this is, again, quite extraordinary synchronicity, because you mentioned the age of 52 being very pivotal. But I guess for the last 2 years, I've been jokingly saying to my friends that I've been in service to the hag, because when I turned 50, I took a really radical decision to step away from my academic job and to become a full-time writer. And I started off this process with a residency in Kilreelig, which is right on the edge of the world. It's just I was in a little cottage on the edge of a cliff in Kerry, wondering what the hell I was doing and why I'd taken this impulsive step. And there I started to connect with the entity of the hag, who had never you know, she'd never drawn me before. But by the end of that month that I spent there, I was absolutely imbued with a sense of purpose. This is what I'm writing about. I junked the novel I was meant to be working on. I junked the collection I was meant to be working on. And I thought, this is it. And I had no idea why I felt so purposeful. But earlier this year, this project was starting to draw to an end. And I was reading more about the hag. So context. The hag is the closest we have in Irish mythology to like a mother goddess or a creator. And she's very unusual in that she's older, unapologetically older. She's had many children and grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren, but she remains very powerful, very sexual. She's all about sovereignty and power, and she is the landscape imbued. Anyway, she has a lover who's Manannán mac Lir, who's the sea god. And they have two daughters. One of them is called Cliona, and she's drowned by her father, who's the vengeful sea god, and she falls in love with a mortal. And then the oddest thing happens because she becomes reborn as Cliona, the monster queen of the fairies and a banshee. During the 1800s, she's said to have had a child with a mortal man who becomes known as Conor Cliona. Conor Cliona, one of his ancestors was the Irish politician Michael Collins. My grandmother was a Collins and a direct descendant of Michael Collins. So honestly, I don't even expect you to believe this because it's such an unlikely series of events that somehow connected me in this absolutely visceral way. And it was almost frightening to realize that this lineage had been there all along. I had no idea why I was being called to it. I had no idea why I'd taken 2 years kind of unpaid leave to wander in the wilderness as a writer. But then it was like, okay, well, this was always what this was the story that I was meant to tell. And I've had a lot of uncanny experiences over the years. I once lived in a house with like poltergeist activity. I've had strange experiences, especially in kind of older places. But this was the most direct manifestation of that sense of purpose I'd felt and an entirely mythological explanation for this.
All right, I want to be your best friend.
That is purely because I'm hag adjacent.
I love that. We should have a t-shirt made that says I'm hag adjacent. Which I think would be really fun and no one would get it, but it'd be like our secret joke. So, yes. Well, thank you for bringing, first of all, that's all astonishing. And I feel like it's, again, like your story that I need a few days to unpack, to understand, and kind of just revel in it. But I love that you brought up, you've had these other uncanny experiences. And this is kind of the nugget of the podcast. So I would love for you to relate some of those stories, whatever you feel comfortable sharing.
Okay, as I always start off with, I'll give you the context. So when I was a child, I was terribly afraid of any kind of supernatural manifestation. And the reason for this was not that our house was built on a much older graveyard, which it was, or that my grandfather was a cemetery keeper and we used to play in the old cemetery, or that my grandmother would tell us frightening folk tales. No, the reason I was terrified was that on both sides of my family, my cousin on my father's side, my aunt on my mother's side had very direct kind of ghostly visitations. And there was this sense that, well, it could be any of you. And I remember as a child very solemnly praying that I wouldn't ever see anything. And in a way, my dream was fulfilled because I've had a lot of experiences that involved hearing things. but I have never seen anything directly supernatural. So where do I start with? I think some of the first major manifestations that I kind of perceived kind of happened towards the end of my teens. I had an experience where I was in a house and there were running footsteps above me, you know, like as on the floor, somebody running around and round. It was only the next day that I realized that there was no upstairs. There was only a pitched roof that clearly nobody could have been running on. But B, that I'd been sleepwalking that night. So there was a great restlessness in the place that was manifesting itself through what I could hear and then my own kind of unconscious activity later that night. As I say, I've never seen anything, but in that house, I had a sense of pulsing blackness that emanated from a particular room. I've seen that pulsing blackness only a few times in my life. And as I say, it isn't even a distinct shape, but it's enough to really fill me with a feeling of the most profound terror. I also lived in a house for about a year where there was a huge amount of activity that I couldn't possibly explain. It was primarily footsteps overhead where there was nobody, a dragging sound, and most terrifyingly of all, the sound of an elderly person coughing in a very protracted way. In that house, windows that had been shut were found open. There were kind of strange kind of smells that would come up from the drains. Most terrifyingly of all, I found written in condensation on the mirror in the bathroom the words "get out." I still don't have any explanation. And I know that I say I was brought up in this quite kind of mystical, kind of religious atmosphere, but I'm intensely pragmatic as well. I always look for an explanation. And this house, there was no explanation. It was a modern house. It was a house that stood sensibly, you know, in a former field. I asked around. No, there were no old monasteries or, you know, kind of strange spaces that undulated. It had just been a field for cattle for as long as anyone could remember. So there was no sense of a historical explanation for what happened in that house, but there was something in that house that did not want me there and that wanted me to leave. Later, I did an art project with some students, and we were in Charleville Forest, which is a very beautiful neo-Gothic house in Ireland, famously haunted. And we had some very strange things happen there. First of all the batteries ran down repeatedly. Secondly, cameras started going off by themselves. There was a lot of object movement as well. Very strange, kind of mischievous. For example, I had a pair of glasses, which ended up in a sealed plastic bag of muesli. So really, really odd, bizarre things. I slept in a room which was the haunted red room, and when I woke up in the morning, a lot of my things had been rearranged in the room, but nobody else had been in. And walking through the house, at one point I went through a concealed passageway, and I kept a sound recorder on for quite a lot of it. it was a 24-hour project. So when I listened to a lot of kind of old audio footage after that. And you can hear quite distinctly a male voice saying, "Get out." It was such a strange thing because there had been 14 of us in the house, all female. So yet again, what I actually believe, and you can dispute this or not, is I think I have a very, very good early warning system that is so inbuilt in me that if I'm in a place where my safety is threatened in any way, that this series of alarms seems to tend to go off. And again, I kind of put it down to all my fervent wishes as a child, you know, to protect myself from this, because I am very conscious that with a lot of manifestations and with a lot of, you know, kind of potent forces, if you like, beyond our ken, that we can't always divine whether they're positive or negative. So I do like to think that I seem to have a protective blanket that surrounds me and warns me if I'm in a situation which may turn at any moment.